On their way home from the party, Jonathan and Nancy stopped at a pharmacy, and Jonathan ran inside. The female cashier perked up as soon as he entered and rushed over with a flip of her hair. "What can I help you with, sir? Looking for anything special?" Jonathan's reply was curt. "Pregnancy tests. 2 of them." The cashier blushed and quickly rang him up without saying another word. When Jonathan climbed back in the car, Nancy looked at him with confusion. "What could you possibly need at this hour?" Jonathan handed her the bag and whispered, "Some answers, hopefully." Nancy's heart fluttered at the sight of the pregnancy tests. Once they arrived home, the couple carefully unpacked and read the instructions. As they waited for the results, Nancy's nerves kicked into overdrive. She prayed that it wasn't the right time for them to have a child. As much as she wanted to start a family with Jonathan, things were still far too fraught for her to imagine bringing a child into the world. Nancy's heart pounded in her chest, and Jonathan stood coolly nearby, holding her hand throughout. When the first test finally registered, a wave of relief swept over Nancy. It was negative. The next 2 soon showed the same result, and she collapsed into Jonathan's arms. He kissed her on the head. "Well, I guess that's that." "Why do you seem so chill right now?" Jonathan shrugged. "We have all the resources in the world. It wouldn't have been ideal, but we would have figured it out." Nancy sighed. She had to admit that she felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. It suddenly struck her as funny how quickly her feelings about having children had changed. 6 months earlier, the notion would have been comical. Jonathan scooped her into his arms and carried her back into the living room. As he sat down on the couch with her, he gently ruffled her hair. "Do I sense a little disappointment?" "No way!" Jonathan offered a reassuring smile. "Whatever you say, just know that our time will come, and when it does, it will be beautiful." Jonathan lifted Nancy off his lap and pulled out a tablet. "Take a look at these vacation options I thought up. Any sound enticing?" Nancy blinked in surprise. "We're taking a trip?" "We've both been under a lot of pressure lately. Now that the Apex is out, it's the perfect time for us to unwind. Plus, with Jacob on winter break, we could bring him along." Nancy looked up. "You still haven't told me how you got him to speak again." Jonathan's eyes softened, his gaze enveloping her. He leaned in for a kiss before answering. "We found a psychiatrist. He helped Jacob move past his psychological trauma." Nancy narrowed her eyes. "That's it. Just like that." Jonathan winked and pushed the tablet into her hands. "All that matters is that he's better. Now let's decide where we're going for our vacation." Nancy glanced at the tablet, and an array of stunning tropical destinations immediately diverted her attention. After Nancy and Jonathan's departure, Xavier offered Esther a ride home, and she accepted with a shrug. He intended to press her on her backstory again, but as soon as the car hit the road, Esther was lulled to sleep by the Apex's climate control. When Xavier noticed her head bobbing up and down, he stifled a laugh and scooted over to place her head on his shoulder. As stubborn and difficult as she so often seemed, he couldn't help but find her goofy drunk slumber endearing. Esther leaned into him without resistance, and as she slept peacefully, he was left to breathe in the faint scent of her perfume. Sensing a couple in the back seat, the car began to play a montage of romantic scenes from classic movies. Xavier was struck by how enveloping the car's sound system was, and as it became more and more taken with the movie, he found his gaze drifting toward Esther's lips. The memory of their kiss earlier that day echoed in his senses, making his breath hitch. The city streets were mercifully clear, and they soon reached Esther's neighborhood. Xavier nudged her. "Which building are you in?" She cracked her eyes, and as soon as she noticed her head resting on Xavier's shoulder, she shot awake. She opened her mouth to clarify, but Xavier abruptly pulled her close, his lips descending on hers without warning. Just as their lips were about to meet, Esther threw up her hand to block him. His mouth found her palm, and he yanked his head back. "What happened to keeping our distance?" she snapped. "That was all you." "Yeah, well, I don't want any more misunderstandings. And that was all you." Well, there won't be any. With that, he moved her hand from his face and kissed her hard. The confined space of the car ignited with unspoken tension. Xavier's self-control, typically ironclad, had wavered ever since he heard her defiant voice on the phone and saw her resilience in the snow. She'd been in his thoughts every moment since. Then, today, he found himself overcome with a sudden urge to kiss her. What had started as a punishment had turned into an obsession, and he could no longer control his feelings around her. As they grew increasingly entangled in each other, a sudden light caught Xavier's eye. The car chimed to life. "Attention, external surveillance detected. Please be mindful of your privacy." Xavier jolted back to reality, becoming acutely aware of the flashlight beam pointed at their car. He quickly pushed Esther into his chest and straightened his posture, turning on the car's interior light in one swift move. On the outside, the group of onlookers gawked at the state-of-the-art car. Holy smokes, talk about a smart car. Scared the hell out of me. When the crowd finally dispersed, Xavier exited the car and swept Esther into his arms. He ascended the stairs 2 at a time, and they soon arrived at her apartment door. As Esther opened the door, Xavier took in the space, and his attention immediately landed on the pair of men's slippers near the shoe rack. His breath hitched in his throat, and his mind raced with questions. Oblivious to his brewing storm, Esther slipped her shoes off and flung her jacket on the couch. "Thanks for seeing me home." He paused, one hand resting against the door frame. His gaze cut sideways, and his tone was heavy. "Esther, be honest with me. Are you really single right now?" She looked caught off guard, but quickly recomposed herself. "Of course. Why else would I be considering that accountant back home?" Stepping inside, Xavier shut the door behind him. "What exactly is your definition of single? Or even better, what is your definition of taken?" Her brows furrowed at his line of questioning. Tired and tipsy, she replied dismissively. "Taken means Liam Nelson is coming to get me, and we both know that's not happening." His chest felt like it had been ignited. A cold sensation began to spread, chilling him to the bone. Every relationship in your life is just one big game to you, isn't it? Finally clocking his temper, her expression hardened. "What business is it of yours whether or not I have a man in my life?" "Why are you so afraid to tell me?" After a brief stalemate, a rebellious spark lit up in Esther's eyes. With a defiant tilt of her head, she looped her arms around his neck. "What's the matter, Mr. Sloan? Want to join the ranks of my many men? Is that why you're so eager to interrogate me? I'm not your toy." Suddenly, she pushed him away with a fierce shove. "Then don't let the door hit you on the way out." Before she got the final word out, Xavier had pinned her against the wall. His heart was ablaze, and kissing her was the only way to assuage the heat. Suddenly, her shoulder hit the light switch and illuminated the living room. From the corner of his eye, he noticed an ashtray on the coffee table. Neither Esther or Maria smoked, so who did the ashtray belong to? An icy realization washed over him. He'd been praying for some excuse, a rationalization for everything she'd done and said. But that little ashtray had shattered all his hopes. Before he could say anything, Esther's energy suddenly shifted and she pushed him away, her voice laden with panic. "Get off me!" Startled, Xavier pulled back, and his gaze met hers. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her fingernails dug deep into his shoulder. He took a step back, and as the light illuminated his face, he saw confusion, realization, and embarrassment crash over Esther in waves. It seemed like in the heat of the moment, she'd confused him with someone else who had tried to hurt her. With the light of the living room casting a soft glow on her face, he noticed the panic still in her eyes and the thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Whatever had happened in her mind had clearly terrified her. The realization sent a peculiar, piercing ache through his heart, and the room fell into a heavy silence as Esther regained her senses. When her gaze finally met Xavier's again, her eyes were as cold as frost. "I don't understand what I did to provoke you. Ever since you came back into my life, you keep approaching me only to get mad that I'm not the person you expected. And just now, her grip on the bedsheet tightened and her tone was resolute. I don't believe we should speak anymore. Just keep your distance in social situations, and I'll do the same. Now please go. His body stiffened at her words, the impact hitting him like a punch. After a pause, he stepped back and pulled the blanket over her. Are you okay? Don't act like you care. I'm sorry I scared you. But she ignored his apology and stubbornly averted his gaze. The air between them grew thick with tension, and as he straightened his clothes to leave, his eyes fell upon Esther's crumbled outfit. The memory of her panicked scream and clenched fist echoed in his mind. He suddenly recalled what Sydney had told him, that after their abduction a few weeks earlier, she'd found it impossible to sleep. She finally had to enter into intensive psychotherapy to help her process the trauma, and had only recently started to feel better. He realized that because Esther had seemed so strong that day, it never occurred to him that she might be suffering the same way, and just doing so silently. And that wasn't even considering all the other horrors she seemed to have endured. Regret washed over Xavier, and he took a small step toward her. How are you doing since those men attacked you in Sydney? She remained silent. I should have asked you sooner. I'm sorry. You just seem so brave. Comforting people had never been his strong suit, but seeing such a strong woman in such a vulnerable place made him determined to try. I'll find you a psychiatrist, get you a security team. But she interrupted him with an icy dismissal. I don't need your charity any more than I need your pity. I have people in my life who care about me and who I trust. You're not one of them, and you never have been. Now, for the last time, please leave. Under normal circumstances, he might have left, discouraged by her repetitive rejections. But her terror-stricken state and the memory of her sorrowful words over the phone angered him to the spot. Esther seemed to sense that he hadn't moved and rolled over in bed with a look of fury on her face. But just as she was about to speak, he caught her hand in his own and held it tight. She glanced down, then yanked her hand from his grip. What is it with you? You storm in, you storm around, you grill me about my relationships like the damn morality police, and now you won't leave? Why can't you just be straight with me? As Xavier was about to speak, his gaze landed on a man's clothes draped over the balcony railing outside the bedroom. His pupils narrowed. Whose clothes are those? Caught off guard, Esther followed his gaze, then broke into a smile. Why? Do you like them? 'Cause you can have them if you want. His anger detonated like a bomb. I knew you weren't single. What's his name? Where is he? She met his gaze defiantly. Well, well, well. It would appear that the inscrutable Mr. Sloane is a little jealous. Xavier fell silent, and a frosty aura enveloping him. It was all he could do to keep his emotions in check. She rolled her eyes. Since you apparently must know, those clothes belong to. But Xavier was finished listening. Enough. Good night, Esther. You won't have to worry about me ever speaking to you again. And with that, he stormed out. Esther was taken aback by Xavier's sudden exit. The explanation she was about to offer lodged in her throat like a stubborn fishbone, and by the time she got it out, he was already gone. A grown man like him should have known. It was safer for a girl living alone to give the appearance of having a male presence. She'd even left men's slippers and an ashtray around the house. Anyone who snuck a peek in her apartment would just assume she didn't live alone. Because she appeared easygoing, Xavier seemed not to care about how his actions affected her. He had never once felt the need to explain himself, even when he crossed a line. He never offered an explanation for the unexpected kiss, the sudden change in demeanor. Nothing. Even after her obvious hints, he was reluctant to reveal his feelings. Restlessness stirred within her, and she got up to get a drink of water. As the cold liquid spilled down her throat, it woke her up and her thoughts became crystal clear. She resolved to distance herself from Xavier, even if his fraught advances had thrilled her. What she really yearned for was someone who truly understood her, who had the patience and confidence to join her in navigating the future. She wanted a relationship like Jonathan and Nancy's, where even misunderstandings were handled with patience. Everyone, no matter how strong they appeared, longed for genuine care. Xavier had never given her a single reason to believe that he could be that person. Having finished her water, Esther locked the door and collapsed onto her bed. In the shadowy corridor below Esther's apartment, Xavier leaned against the wall, half cloaked in darkness, half bathed in the glow of a distant street lamp. His silhouette mirrored the mood brewing within him. A turmoil tore at his heart, a struggle between disbelief and a desire to be close to her. He wasn't ready to swallow his pride, to admit his internal conflict. But then, what the hell was he doing standing in the hall? The thought took him aback. Was it possible that he had developed feelings for her? And if he had, what possible reason was there? His mind flooded with memories, yet they all seemed tainted somehow. He realized with a jolt that he couldn't answer the second question. The realization cast a deep shadow over his heart, and he lingered in the hallway a while longer, until he heard the lock slam shut on Esther's door. Across the city, Hannah sat in the window of a bustling bar with a row of empty glasses lined up before her. She gazed out, her eyes glazing over, brimming with unshed tears. Suddenly, a figure approached. A young man with vibrantly colored hair sauntered over with a whistle on his lips. "Damn, beautiful. What are you doing all alone?" Hannah just dismissed him, her gaze locked on the world outside the window. Feeling snubbed, the man tried to seize her hand, but she recoiled with disgust and shoved him away. "Get lost." Undeterred, he cracked a deviant smile and sidled up next to her, reaching out to pull her into his arms. She rose to her feet to step away, but the room suddenly swam, the alcohol in her system threatening to topple her into his waiting arms. Just as she was about to fall, a strong arm stretched out and guided her away from the unwanted company. She found herself ensnared in a wide, unfamiliar embrace, and when she lifted her gaze, she saw only a sharp jawline above her. The stranger hugged her close and addressed the other man. "She said to get lost. I suggest you listen." Hearing those words, Hannah's heart trembled. Years ago, Hannah had been a target of bullies in high school, and when Jonathan first stepped in to protect her, he said the exact same words. In an instant, it felt as if a heavy blow had struck her heart, a distant memory snaking its way through time to seize her. Hannah felt all her defenses crumble. She knew the man wasn't Jonathan, but in that exact moment, she decided she didn't care. A sudden hatred bloomed within her, and she could feel nothing but spite for all the years she'd wasted pining after a man who'd never spared her a second glance. Perhaps she'd never be free of that burden, but she was at least prepared to find out. Without another word, Brock ushered Hannah into his car and drove them straight to a hotel. This was the second time he'd found himself in this situation with the exact same person. But unlike last time, she suddenly seemed interested. When they got to the room, he gently set her down on the couch, and she looked at him with a strange combination of expectation and sorrow. Brock's eyes narrowed, and a surge of hostility erupted within him. Ever since Ashley's humiliating episode with Jonathan and Maria, her temptation had taken a dramatic turn. She'd become more than a shut-in, and her demeanor was gloomy in a way he'd never experienced. Even when they were growing up, shuttled between the loveless homes of their separated parents, Ashley was a beacon of light. She had been his closest companion during his most difficult time, and his love for her had been ingrained since childhood. Anytime he had had an opportunity to improve her life, he took it. But after everything with Jonathan and Maria, he felt powerless to help her for the first time in his life. As he dwelled on this, a whirlpool of emotions swirled within him. Hannah was practically Jonathan's sister. She clearly wanted him, and if Jonathan found out they'd had sex, it would drive him crazy. Brock's gaze fell on Hannah, and she called him over with her eyes. He'd had every intention of leaving her there like last time, but he couldn't pass up the opportunity to get at Jonathan. Brock stooped down and picked Hannah up from the sofa. She moaned softly and stroked the back of his head, while he carried her to the bed. Laying her down, Brock pressed his body against hers, and their lips met. She shuddered at first, but quickly became fervent, pulling him along at a speed he never expected. As they joined together and her entire body tensed, she bit his ear and whispered, "Repeat what you said to that man at the bar." "What?" He was taken aback that she suddenly decided to speak. "Say what you said to that guy you saved me from, and hold me down while you do it." Hannah had no idea what had come over her. She hadn't thought Brock was particularly attractive when they'd met in the hall of the Diamond Club a few months back, but when she had her chance to play out her Jonathan fantasy, she couldn't resist. Now she found herself taking the initiative and asking for things she never knew she wanted until right now. "Say it, Brock. Threaten him, and then tell me you'll protect me." Brock growled the lines into her ear, and a surge of ecstasy flowed through her. For the first time in her life, she knew how it felt to get what she wanted. The following day, morning sunlight streamed through the French windows, draping Hannah in its warm embrace. Stirred by the light, her eyelashes fluttered open. She took in the room with a renewed awareness, and memories of the previous night surged forward like a tidal wave. Brock had long since left, and the only part of him that lingered was the distinct smell of cigarette. Just as well, Hannah thought. She didn't want to talk to him anyway. With a swift motion, she flung the blanket aside and fully absorbed the reality of the situation. In a moment of drunk confidence, she had sex with a virtual stranger in hopes of purging her love for Jonathan. In the harsh light of day, she realized it wouldn't be so easy. She padded to the bathroom and took in her reflection in the mirror. Her body was painted with signs from her encounter. What she'd done the night before had been reckless and stupid. She knew that. But she'd also be lying if she said she totally regretted it. As she let the shower cascade over her, her mind inevitably wandered back to Jonathan. A pang of sadness pricked at her, and she suddenly found herself sobbing. Unable to control the outpouring of emotion, Hannah slid down the shower wall and curled up on the floor. Her crying echoed around the steamy bathroom, but they were no longer tears of helplessness. They were a testament to her difficult past and her fresh determination to overcome it. At that same moment, Nancy stirred awake in Jonathan's apartment, her eyes snapping open in the bright morning sun. She glanced over at Jonathan, who was lounging beside her. "I know where we should go on vacation." Jonathan absentmindedly twirled a lock of her hair around his finger. "Oh, really? Where are we off to then, princess?" Nancy's eyes glittered with excitement. "I had a dream about it last night. How about the Dominican Republic? We could enjoy the ocean, and you said you wanted to take Jacob camping, right? There's an amazing national park." Jonathan nodded. "Sounds good. Happy wife, happy life, right?" Nancy smacked him playfully. "Don't be so cliché." "I'll have Jack arrange the travel details today." Suddenly he stood up and reached out to Nancy. "Time for our morning workout, Maria." "Speak for yourself. I woke up 30 seconds ago." "Yeah, but if you don't go with me, you won't go at all." "Exactly." Nancy smirked, and in a flash, Jonathan picked her up and threw her over his shoulder. "Sorry, sweetie. A deal is a deal." He started dressing her in running clothes, and she reluctantly took over, glancing out the window at the chilly scene below. "If I get frostbite, I'll never forgive you." Jonathan rolled his eyes and zipped up her coat. "That'll change once we get moving. You'll see." Hand in hand, they stepped outside and were immediately met by a brisk gust of wind. Nancy jumped behind Jonathan and yelped in surprise. "How about just one lap?" But Jonathan was finished negotiating. He grabbed her hand and took off jogging. Despite her initial resistance, Nancy soon found herself feeling energized. But when Jonathan glanced over at her with a smug grin, she feigned fatigue and gasped out a plea. "I'm so tired. Can't we go home? I'll run again when it's warm, like every other mammal." He glanced at her. "You know the deal. You're finishing either way, on your own 2 feet or in my hands, like a helpless baby in front of all of Central Park." She was about to protest, but he continued. Plus, I'm 9 years older than you. In a couple decades, I might not be able to carry you around at all. And then where will we be? Wasting away together?" Nancy laughed. "Yeah, how are you going to feel when I'm pushing you around in a wheelchair and everyone thinks I'm your daughter?" "I can think of a few ways to set them straight." "Jonathan! Still going to be a fiend even when you're 80, apparently. Until the day we die." He paused and winked at her. "Which is all the more reason to stay in shape." Nancy couldn't help but smirk. "You know, I'm starting to think you're only being this good to me so you'll have a hot younger wife to take care of you when you're old. I'm just another Jonathan Davis strategy." He shrugged. "Any good businessman knows how to play the long game." As they continued jogging, Nancy intertwined their fingers, and their laughter and banter filled the air. The gloomy winter weather in Houston matched Stark's mood as he glowered at the numbers on his desk before sweeping them onto the floor in a fit of anger. Beside him, his assistant held another report, but he was hesitant to hand it over. Stark, however, was in no mood for games. He snatched the financial statement out of his assistant's hands, and his eyes narrowed at the sea of red figures. He wanted to rip the damn report to shreds. His assistant stammered, not wanting to deliver more bad news. "As expected, sir, we've had to halt our international ad buys and lay off most of the marketing department. Our profits simply can't support them." Stark said nothing, his icy gaze fixated on the paper before him. In an attempt to mitigate the damage from the press conference video incident, he dipped into his personal funds for a PR campaign. The results had been promising, and for a while, it looked like his efforts would pay off. But the launch of the Apex had shattered his plans. Even the major fleet contract he was about to sign with FedEx had been diverted to the Davis Group at the last minute. Stark's entire time as CEO had been a long bet on the future of autonomous vehicles, and it suddenly seemed as if 5 long years of investment, with little to no return, had been wasted. The shortfalls would soon start to weigh on the shareholders, and with it would go their trust. He was out of chances with the board, and with Jacob in the wind, the only way to save himself was to find a way to make money. Just then, Stark saw an employee in his outer office pull a cup of coffee out of the microwave and groan to a coworker. "How is it even possible that microwaves are so stupid? This thing is 6 months old, and it already can't heat up coffee." A chilling determination flickered in Stark's eyes, and he ordered his assistant out. He had a plan, but he was going to have to pivot the entire AI department in a matter of weeks if it was going to work. If he had learned anything in life, it was that when you got backed into a corner, you had to strike. The following day, the Franklin Group announced a global release of a broad new range of AI products. Home service robots, home appliances, facial recognition systems, and more. Stark knew he had one of the most powerful radars and processing algorithms on the planet, and if he was nimble enough, there was virtually no technology he couldn't squeeze it into. When the first numbers came back that afternoon, Stark was relieved to see a steady rise in the stock price throughout the afternoon, and healthy pre-orders for their upcoming products. Thousands of miles away, Jack entered Jonathan's office looking concerned. "As you predicted, the Franklin Group has pivoted to a broad range of AI-enabled technology products. What's our move?" Jonathan contemplated for a moment, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Let's hold back for now. We'll make our move at midnight, the day after tomorrow." "But sir, the Franklin Group's shareholders' meeting is tomorrow morning. If we announce it now, it could be the final nail in Stark's coffin." Jonathan shook his head. "The markets won't have enough time to react. We just need to be a little patient. Let him have his positive meeting tomorrow morning and make all kinds of promises. Then we'll swoop in and pull the rug out from underneath him. Everyone knows our technology is better, and when people start pulling pre-orders, it'll send them into free fall." Jack turned to leave, then hesitated. "Can I ask, what did Stark do to drive this sudden competition?" Jonathan leaned forward with a murderous look in his eyes. "Let's just say he started it." The following day, the Franklin Group shareholders convened, and by then the stock had continued on its upward path for nearly 2 days. It was hardly a total recovery, but it offered some relief, and Stark was met with a fraction of the opprobrium he'd received the previous quarter. As the meeting adjourned, Stark released a weary sigh. His pivot had worked, at least for now. In an effort to relax, Stark spent the evening with Lexi at his penthouse and arrived at work later than usual the next morning. As he walked the halls to his office, he failed to sense the palpable tension in the air. He settled in at his desk and pulled up the stock report, and leaned back in relief when he saw that his gain streak had extended to a 3rd day. A few more weeks like this, and he'd be back in the board's good graces. He was about to summon his assistant to schedule a victorious press conference when a tech headline caught his eye. It read, "Davis Group announces global launch of new products at 5 p.m. Releases include housekeeping robots, bodyguards, high-end VR entertainment consoles, and enterprise solutions." Stark studied the headline, and a pit grew in his stomach. He pulled up the full article and saw that it contained an in-depth overview of the Davis Group's new products alongside his own, and the comparisons were not favorable. Not only was their design more eye-catching, they had somehow managed to undercut his prices by 5 to 10%. In his previous battles, Stark had been able to leverage the Franklin Group's significant financial muscle to win price wars like this, but that required buy-in he no longer had. Between this rollout and the underwhelming Phoenix sales, they were on the verge of losing control over the entire market. Eyeing the stock price wavering in real time, Stark snatched up his phone. "Pull up Jonathan's schedule for the past 6 months." The person on the other end hesitated. "Jonathan? The Davis Group's president?" "No, Jonathan Taylor Thomas. Of course I mean Jonathan Davis." There was a brief pause. "That might be a challenge, sir. He's known to be extremely private." "And I'm known to be extremely unpleasant when I don't get what I want." Stark seethed, but tried to calm his fraying nerves. "I think he's behind Jacob's disappearance, okay? Follow that lead." Stark pocketed his phone, and his mind raced, trying to pull together the threads that had been eluding him. Jonathan seemed to know every move he was going to make before he made it. It had given him the continual upper hand when it came to their business rivalry, but it had recently occurred to Stark that only someone with that amount of influence and information would have been capable of the operation that led to Jacob's abduction. He had no way to prove his hunch, but he had to see it through. He punched the button for the intercom and snapped at his assistant. "Get me a flight to New York. I want to leave within the hour." Nancy had been taking it easy in the few days after New Year's, but her restless nature soon got the better of her, and by the 4th day, she found herself back at the Brooklyn lab in the early morning. She was unsurprised, but overjoyed, to see the rest of her teammates had all had the same impulse. Although the Apex's initial development was complete, they knew their journey was far from over. The next generation would be expected to make major improvements, and there was no time to spare in beginning that work. Nancy ordered coffee for everyone and gathered them around a huge whiteboard. For the rest of the day, all they did was brainstorm, and by 5 that afternoon, the concept for their next project had a name: Aries. The following day, Nancy had a promotional gig in Soho for Unique. It was one of the flagship events for New York Fashion Week, and Nancy's biggest public appearance yet. The same was true for Esther, who wasn't quite as used to the spotlight. When Nancy finally arrived, Esther frantically waved her over. "What color lipstick should I go with?" "You're asking me? Aren't you the mysterious world-famous fashion maven?" "Yeah, I'm just stressed and anxious. And did I mention stress? So which do you think?" Nancy winked and grabbed one for her. "Don't worry. You'll do great up there. And if you don't, I'll be there with you afterwards to laugh about it. Full disclosure, I might also laugh at you." Esther smacked her playfully and put on the lipstick. "All right, I'm going to double-check the venue. After you're done with makeup, come find me." At that very moment, Stark was in a taxi driving down Broadway. Because of his suspicions, he was accompanied by 2 bodyguards this time, instead of his usual assistants. As they passed Spring State Park, Something on a large screen caught Stark's eye. His pupils narrowed to pinpoints, and he shouted at the driver. "Stop the car!" The driver glanced back at his trepidation. "You know we just can't park anywhere we want, right?" Stark pulled out a wad of $100 bills and threw them to the driver. "Just stop the car!" With no further objections, the driver swerved to the curb and threw it into park. Stark got out and crossed the busy intersection back toward the event with the video board. In the middle of the park, a booth was swarming with people. Stark dove into the crowd and began pushing through without hesitation while his 2 bodyguards scrambled to keep up. He finally maneuvered to the front and around the stage, seeing that it was a live promotional event for unique perfume. He recognized the brand from Maria's Instagram and narrowed his eyes. When his bodyguards finally caught up with him, they were gasping for air. "Sir, we can't protect you when you get too far out ahead." "What did you see? Is there a threat?" Stark held up a hand, and both men fell silent. His attention was riveted on the stage, and on the video screen behind it that cycled through various clips and images from Unique's flagship opening. Just then, the host took the stage to wild applause. "How are you doing, New York? Thank you so much for coming out to this live event, and without further ado, let's welcome to the stage the founder, master perfumer, and all-around badass behind Unique, Sabrina." She strolled on stage, accepted the microphone from the host, and offered a demure wave to the audience. "Thank you so much for being here. This is so incredible. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Sabrina." At the front of the stage, Stark's gaze locked onto her, his hands slowly clenching into white-knuckled fists. Stark's heart pounded in his chest as he gazed at a woman he was certain he had killed. If this wasn't Esther, then the likeliness was extraordinary. The only factor that gave him pause was that if Esther truly had survived being thrown off that boat, he couldn't imagine her embracing the spotlight like this. Stark's fingers flew over his phone, composing a brisk message. "Get me everything there is on a perfumer named Sabrina. Now." On stage, Esther entertained the crowd with wit and charm as she told the story of how she came to become a perfumer and found the company. Her stunning presence elicited cheers and applause, and she promised a surprise gift for one lucky audience member, a custom perfume designed by her during a live-streamed appointment. Stark's phone buzzed with incoming information on Sabrina. Her birth name appeared to be Olivia, and according to public records, she was born in New York to middle-class parents. A profile picture was attached, and Stark held it up to compare with the woman on stage. They were utterly identical. Stark's mind reeled. Was there truly such a perfect doppelganger in this world? As he continued reading, another revelation struck him. Olivia was married to Latham, Jonathan's childhood friend. If Sabrina truly was Olivia, could it be that Esther had a twin sister who was now seeking revenge for Esther's death? And what about their connection to Jonathan? Could they have collaborated on the mission of liberating Jacob? He had to admit that the theory seemed far-fetched, but it was still a lead. Backstage, Esther concluded her segment and turned to Nancy. "Darling, you're up." Nancy grinned. "I've had enough of this public life. All I seem to do lately is wear dresses and sell things to people." Esther leaned in, whispering, "Settling down before you're even married? I'm disappointed." Nancy shot her a playful glare, straightened her skirt, and prepared to step on stage. Just then, Sahara sidled up next to her. "Maria, I scanned a familiar face in the audience. Details? Stark, 30 years old, from Houston." Nancy cut her off. "You spotted Stark?" "Affirmative. 3 o'clock, 50 feet back." Nancy's jaw dropped, but before she could respond, the host called out her name. Esther grabbed her arm, and she turned back. "If Stark is onto us, you shouldn't go out there. He's capable of anything." Nancy furrowed her brow. "It's no secret I work for your company. He was bound to catch on to that sooner or later. Besides, if I don't go on stage, he'll get even more suspicious." With a last reassuring look, she sashayed onto the stage. Meanwhile, Esther sent Sahara to get an image of Stark and track his position. Back in the audience, Stark watched Maria and couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing some crucial piece of information. All of the connections playing out before him seemed too conspicuous to be a coincidence. But so far, everyone's alibis were ironclad. He watched with narrow eyes as the host interviewed Maria about how she came to get involved with the unique perfumes. As he marveled at her beauty, it occurred to him that he might simply be making everything up in his mind because Maria had reminded him of Nancy a time or two. After all, there were billions of people in the world. It's entirely possible that one who looked like Esther had an employee who reminded him of former fiancé. Nonetheless, he would have to test these theories himself before he'd ever believe it. At that exact moment, Xavier was meeting Jonathan at a nearby restaurant. Buzz about Esther's event was all over the neighborhood, and seeing the name of her company everywhere, he couldn't help thinking about the last time they parted. As they sat down at the restaurant, Jonathan seemed to sense his distraction and raised an eyebrow. "I'm meeting Maria after this, and I hear Esther will be there. Would you like to join me?" "Why would I?" Jonathan chuckled. "Xavier, even the straightest of flowers can bend. And you were so insistent on taking her home the other night. Since when did you put yourself out there like that for a woman?" Xavier sighed. "All right, Inspector Gadget. You got me. I found myself thinking about her often and decided to get closer to her. But it's absolutely impossible. Everything is a game, and she refuses to even tell me what happened in her past." Jonathan's face grew serious. "I consider Esther a friend, but I'll tell you what I know. Maria explained everything to me, and I have to say, she's an impressive person." Xavier was taken aback. He couldn't remember the last time he heard Jonathan compliment someone so frankly. Jonathan took a sip of water and began. "About 4 years ago, she lost her best friend Nancy in what she believed was a tragic accident. After a while, she began to grow suspicious about her friend's fiancé, Stark, and soon unearthed some troubling clues. Unfortunately, he caught wind of her investigation and attempted to have her killed." Xavier caught his breath, his hands instinctively balling into fists. "The men Stark sent left her for dead, but she was miraculously rescued by a group of villagers on a remote island in the Mediterranean. Though she had survived the attempted assassination, the injuries she sustained stole her sight. It took her more than a year to recover it, and it was in that period that she learned to craft incense and perfumes, paving the way for the success she's having today." Xavier's heart swirled with emotion as he listened to Esther's story. He had misread so many of her actions as wanton disregard, when she had only been trying to protect herself from reliving past traumas. The always smiling girl, who persistently ventured into his world, had suffered more than he could ever have imagined. Now, knowing the truth, he found himself moved by Esther's strength and envious of her former friend. It was clear that if you really touched her heart, there was nothing she wouldn't do for you. More than anything, he felt an intense desire to make her feel safe and supported. Seeming to notice Xavier's turmoil, Jonathan chimed back in. "It boils down to this. If you're into her, stop beating around the bush. If not, let her go." Xavier nodded. "You're right. Thanks, Jonathan." When they finished their meal, Jonathan led Xavier down the street to the unique event, anxious to see Maria doing her thing on stage. They breezed through the VIP entrance, thanks to Jonathan's pass, and once inside, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Aries. Nancy had taken Sahara and left him Aries earlier that morning, planning a sentimental reunion for the two of them later in the day. It warmed his heart that she always found time for romance, despite how independent she was. So despite finding it a tad exasperating, he played along. To his surprise, just as he and Xavier were both about to enter the audience near the stage, Aries vibrated in his hand. Jonathan glanced down, and a synthesized male voice came through. "Alert! First-level target identified. Stark is located in the audience." Jonathan halted in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. "Capture an image and send it to my phone." Seconds later, his phone lit up with a picture of Stark, standing amidst the crowd, his gaze fixed on Maria and Esther in a way that Jonathan could only describe as predatory. His mind raced, and he swiftly tugged Xavier back into the VIP tent. "We can't go out there." Clocking Jonathan's severe expression, Xavier looked baffled. "What's the problem?" Jonathan thrust his phone toward Xavier. "That's Stark, the head of the Franklin Group. He's the one who tried to kill Esther, and he's in the audience. We need to regroup and make sure she and Maria are both safe." Xavier's eyes narrowed at the image, and before Jonathan could stop him, he darted toward the stage. Thinking fast, Jonathan whipped his phone out and called Latham. He picked up with a cheerful tone. "What's up, chicken butt? How would you like to buy your best friend dinner tonight?" "Latham, get to Soho, now. The man who tried to kill Esther is here, and if I know him, he'll find a way to confront her. You need to get down here and help her sell the Olivia story." Hanging up, Jonathan rushed to join Xavier at the bottom of the stage, where he was eyeing Esther anxiously. "Stark doesn't know me. Should I?" "No. He wouldn't make a move like that in public. Besides, Olivia is technically Latham's wife. If Stark saw her with another man, he'd only be more suspicious." He patted Xavier's shoulder. "Don't worry. She'll be okay." Despite his reassurance to Xavier, Jonathan was well aware that Maria's public association with Esther might bring suspicion on her as well. And because of her job with the Franklin Group, she had far more reason to be alone with Stark in the future. He quickly ordered Ares to contact Zahara and forward his location to Nancy and Esther's phones, as well as the fact that Latham was on the way. The event drew to a close 30 minutes later, with Esther presenting a custom perfume to the lucky fan, and finally retreating backstage with Nancy. Zahara filled them in on Latham's imminent arrival, and both of their phones buzzed with a text from Jonathan. "Stay calm. Norman has secured the entire park, and neither of you are in any danger. Keep Zahara with you at all times, and she'll broadcast your audio and location to Xavier and I." Esther's eyes narrowed at the mention of Xavier. She couldn't imagine how he came to be involved, after everything that had been said between them. Nonetheless, she had to focus on the performance she was about to put on for Stark. She thanked the crew members warmly as they departed, and then made her way to the makeup area, where she told Latham to meet her. Putting out the lipstick that Nancy had suggested to her, she focused on applying it and trying to calm her nerves. Just as she moved to put the lipstick away, an elbow nudged her, and she dropped it to the floor. She bent over to retrieve it, but the other person was quicker, handing it to her and apologizing warmly. "I'm terribly sorry, miss." Assuming it was a tech, Esther didn't look up right away, checking to see whether her lipstick had broken in the fall. When she finally raised her gaze, her heart skipped a beat and her grip tightened around the tube of lipstick. She had just met Stark's gaze head-on for the first time since he tried to kill her. By all appearances, he seemed to be the same courteous man he always had been, but now that she knew his true nature, she found it harder than she ever imagined not to spit in his face and shove her white-hot curling iron down his throat. Still, she knew she had to mask her feelings, shooting him a glare of annoyance before returning her attention to the broken lipstick. Out of the corner of her eyes, she caught his reflection in her makeup mirror and saw him scrutinizing her with narrowed eyes. Then, with a malicious sneer, he leaned down to her ear and whispered, "I know it's you, Esther." A moment of terror seized Esther's heart at the sound of Stark's words, but she quickly decided it was nothing but a trap. She leaned away from him with a haughty glare and shot back with confidence. "I'm sorry. Can you take a step back?" "But Esther, it's me!" Stark exclaimed, his eyes wide with surprise. "I thought you went to teach in some remote mountain region. How did you end up here?" His eyes radiated the joy of reunion, and Esther quietly marveled at his acting talent while she gaped back at him. "I'm sorry. Do you work here? Because I have no idea who you are, and you just broke my lipstick and whispered at me like a creep." At the sound of her confident New York accent, she saw Stark's face flash with surprise. Before he could fumble out a response, Latham appeared in the doorway and strode towards them. "Olivia!" At the sound of his voice, Esther turned towards him, and her face broke into a huge smile. Hubby! He swept her into his arms and kissed her on the cheek. I'm sorry I'm late, darling. How did it go? Esther playfully pursed her lips. Wouldn't you like to know? You're getting punished for this later. Latham winked at her. Then I look forward to my wife's punishment. His gaze wandered to the confused Stark. Can I help you, dude? Just then, Nancy emerged from the dressing room in street clothes and sauntered over. Latham! So great to see you. Too bad it's at 3 p.m. instead of 1 p.m. Latham threw up his hands. Everyone's a critic. Nancy's attention then turned to Stark, and her face lit up with surprise. Stark? What are you doing here? Stark nodded affably. I was in town for a meeting and heard you were doing an event, so I thought I'd stop by. You really can sell anything, Maria. Thank you so much. Believe it or not, we were both actually quite nervous. Cameras in a studio is one thing, but live on stage is a whole other one. She winked at Esther. I'm glad you mentioned Sabrina. I'm afraid we had a terrible misunderstanding. She happens to bear an uncanny resemblance to an old friend of mine. Finally, Esther interjected. I'm sorry. I still have no idea who this guy is. Nancy laughed. This is my other employer, the CEO of Franklin Group. I'm sure you've heard of him. Esther hummed with disinterest. Oh, so you're Stark. Seeming to sense her displeasure, Stark offered a conciliatory smile. I really do apologize for breaking your lipstick. Let me know the brand and color, and I'll replace it today. Before Esther could respond, Latham drew her close. No need. My wife only uses the lipstick I give her. It's a little tradition we have. With a playful smile, Esther turned to Latham. In that case, I want two. Stark nodded and chimed back in. Well, I insist on making it up to you somehow. How about lunch? Nancy hesitated before turning to Esther for her opinion. Stark, hoping for an ally, gave Nancy a pleading look. Sensing the pressure, Nancy caved. Of course. That sounds wonderful. About time my two employers meet. Latham eyed Stark before agreeing too. Why not? The more the merrier. To Nancy's infinite relief, they made it through lunch without any major issues. Stark had clearly thought he could surprise Esther into revealing her true identity, but they had foiled his plan thanks to Zahara. They escaped unscathed, and Nancy was confident that they hadn't given him any new ammunition in his war of paranoia. Later that evening, Stark was at an upscale club in Chelsea when he felt a friendly hand on his shoulder. He spun around and saw none other than Jonathan Davis. Jonathan smiled warmly. Stark, in New York City, and you didn't allow me to play host? Stark offered a diplomatic smile. I'm just visiting a friend. Didn't want to intrude on your time. Well, coincidentally, I have a few friends here too. How about joining us for a drink? Stark accepted and soon found himself in Jonathan's private booth, alongside Jonathan's assistant Jack and a couple of unfamiliar faces. As Jonathan introduced them, a pit formed in Stark's stomach. All of them represented companies he had lost business from since the debacle at the press conference. To Stark's surprise, one of them extended a business card with a glint of anticipation in his eyes. Stark, I hear the Franklin Group has an impressive product line coming down the pipe. Should the opportunity arise, we'd love to collaborate with both of you. Stark's thoughts swirled. Had Jonathan planned this to embarrass him? Or was this a genuine fig leaf? He'd have to just wait and see. Stark soon found himself engaged in a game of billiards with Jonathan, who had been waited on by a young woman named Rose. She held a plate of strawberries and fed them to him seductively, and Stark couldn't help but smile at the sight. Jonathan was known to stay above the fray when it came to women, but that was clearly just for show. Stark had seen him drop hints with Maria, and now here he was being fed by a beautiful young stranger. The game began, and Stark was unsurprised when Jonathan matched him shot for shot. When Jonathan boxed him out of a corner pocket with a well-placed ball, Stark saw an opportunity. You know, Jonathan, Rushing into other people's territories, claiming what's not yours, it's not always the wisest move. Jonathan, ever the calm competitor, responded without looking up from the table. In my opinion, everything depends on one's capabilities. Some are to be conquered, and some are to be conquerors. What's your take? As Stark pondered his subtext, Jonathan finally missed a shot. Stark stepped up to the table and casually scored a few more points of his own, and Jonathan enjoyed another strawberry. Finally, Stark set down his pool cue and decided to say it straight. Jonathan, as you know, I'm merely an employee of the Franklin Group, not the owner. Maybe it's just my imagination, but it feels like you have it out for me all of a sudden. Jonathan set his cue on the table and replied with a slight smile. I'm a businessman. I only pursue things that stand to benefit me, and I don't waste time with anything else that doesn't. We're obviously competitors, but I'm interested in numbers, not grudges. In that case, I have a proposition for you. We can keep going toe-to-toe on every bid and screwing each other on margin, but we both know that neither of us has the production infrastructure to sustain it. If we find ways to work together, even if it's just the supply chain, we can lower prices and improve margins for everyone. Rising tide, and all of that. Jonathan pondered, then excused Rose. All right, Stark, I'm listening. That night, sleep evaded Stark. He mulled over the day's events and struggled to string them together in his head. He resorted to drawing a diagram of everything that had happened in the last few months. To his astonishment, at the intersections of all the lines was a single name, Maria. His heart pounded erratically. Maria had always seemed to be the epitome of innocence, but the facts couldn't lie. If he took Maria out of the picture, every other connection would fall apart. He lacked anything concrete, but the circumstantial evidence painted a compelling picture. It was time for him to tighten the screws on innocent little Maria and find out once and for all what she knew about Jonathan, Olivia, and Jacob. Once back on home soil, Stark gathered his team and dispatched them to retrieve Amelia from her captors. They had badly misjudged Stark's willingness to pay a ransom for her, and in reality, he was fine with them treating her however they wanted. It was only when it finally seemed like they were serious about killing her that he decided it was time to intervene. Less than 24 hours later, Stark entered his bedroom to find Amelia sitting on the bed, a shell of her former self. Her hair was ragged, her clothes were too big, and she smelled like she hadn't showered in a week. But her eyes still contained the same white-hot rage they had the last time he saw her. Well, well, looks like the kitty found her way back home. Was it scary out in the wild? Can it, Stark? We both know you were never going to let them kill me. Of course not. I'm far too excited to do that myself. Amelia sneered, but before she could respond, a maid knocked on the door. Sir, Lexi is here. Perfect timing! With a chipper smile, he fastened handcuffs around Amelia's ankles and secured her to the bed. He then pulled Lexi into his arms and placed a passionate kiss on her lips. Amelia shrieked at the sight, but Stark merely smiled. Then he leaned down and whispered into Lexi's ear. I appreciate a smart woman who knows when to advance and when to hold back. One who knows what to say and what to keep to herself. Do you understand? Lexi responded with a sugary smile. Better than her, evidently. Stark smirked and pulled away. Superior in every way. Now make yourself at home. I'm off for a shower. When Stark shut the bathroom door behind him, Lexi shot Amelia a skeptical look, and her eyes burned with hatred. Enjoy your victory lap, slut. Just wait until he tires of you. You'll be worse off than me. Lexi shrugged, her sugary demeanor suddenly gone. I've dealt with worse than him. You know what your problem is, Amelia? You only had one weapon, and the second you ran out of bullets, you lost the war. What the hell is that supposed to mean? You're busted, babe. You couldn't get away with being like Stark when you were young and beautiful. But then you shriveled up like a raisin, and now you've got nothing. I had to fight and claw to get where I am. All you had to do was show up." Amelia seethed with rage, shaking uncontrollably. "Mark my words. When I get out of these handcuffs, I'm going to enjoy watching you die." "Ooh, scary." "Here's the deal, Mimi. You mind if I call you Mimi? I know about the video, so I have an offer. Give me the video, and I'll make Stark let you go." "How stupid do you think I am?" "Do you really want me to answer that?" "Shut up, you little rat." "You stick with Stark, it's mutually assured destruction. Side with me, and you get to move to California to live with all the other raisins." With a wink, Lexi began unbuttoning her shirt and sauntered off to the bathroom. The next afternoon, Nancy exited the Davis group and made her way to a cake shop across the street. She had been obsessed with her cupcakes for weeks now, and when she emerged, she was holding a miniature red velvet cupcake topped with buttercream frosting. Just as she was about to enjoy it, a whisper in her bag startled her. It was the AI she'd programmed to run on all her accessories. When she pulled her phone out, she heard the message loud and clear. "You're being followed." She glanced down at her phone as the AI pulled up a picture of him. Pursuer identified as Stark's personal bodyguard. Generating escape routes now. Nancy shook her head as she looked at the picture of the bodyguard following her. She had a 5-man security team that had undoubtedly noticed him as well, so she felt no danger, but she suddenly wondered if it might be an opportunity to throw Stark off. After all, she knew that Amelia held incriminating evidence, but with Amelia in Stark's grasp, and possibly already dead, accessing that video seemed nearly impossible. To make matters worse, Stark had clearly grown suspicious of her in the past few weeks. If she was ever going to get close enough to him to take him down, she was going to have to convince him that she was every bit the innocent and naive girl she'd been pretending to be. She pondered her predicament, and in a sudden moment of clarity, she whispered into her phone, "Help me lose my security team." Her AI immediately responded, "Understood. Generating route." The map appeared in front of her in a matter of seconds, and after 2 quick turns, she dodged into a narrow alley. Just as she stepped off the sidewalk, a sudden grip of her wrist froze her in place. A hard object pressed into her back, and a gruff voice whispered, "One peep and you're dead." As Nancy's captor dug his gun into her back, she held her tongue and let him lead her away without protest. Half an hour later, Nancy was roughly deposited into an abandoned factory, her hands and feet bound. A rough hand suddenly tore the tape from her mouth and growled in her ear, "Where's Jacob?" Nancy looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What Jacob? You've got the wrong person. I'm Maria Miller." The henchman scoffed at Nancy's denial. He unsheathed a knife, and his cold blade glinted ominously. "Does this jog your memory, sweetheart?" Nancy's eyes brimmed with fear, and tears began spilling over. "I don't know any Jacobs. I'm just an NYU student. I haven't wronged anyone." The henchman shouted at a laugh and held the knife to Nancy's throat. The sharp blade pricked her skin. "How's that for a little incentive? If it's not enough, don't worry. There's plenty more where that came from." Nancy stammered, sobbing hysterically, but the henchman pushed his knife further into Nancy's flesh. "This is your carotid artery. You know how fast you'll die if I cut that? You won't even have time to say your prayers." A rivulet of blood snaked down her neck as Nancy whimpered, I don't know. From his hiding spot on the other side of a false wall, Stark suddenly received a message from one of his lieutenants. "We have eyes on Sabrina. We'll update after extraction." Stark dashed out a quick reply. "Good. Let's get this over with." Putting away his phone, he looked up and saw Maria's tear-streaked face and terrified sobs. Scenes of their past suddenly flashed through his mind. Her endearing smile, her surprise when he presented her the spokesperson contract, her pure joy when she won the robotics competition. She had captured his imagination right away, and until recently, he'd seen her as a delicate bloom, untouched and untarnished, a treasure that he dared not disturb. And now, here he was, on the precipice of ending her life. A gnawing discomfort seized his chest. He couldn't bear to watch her suffer. His heart begged him to let her go, but his mind refused. He had to keep his eye on the prize. Jacob had been liberated, and now Jonathan had set his sight on his business. The layers of complexity were stacking up like so many dead bodies, and Stark's hands had already been drenched in blood. If he let her walk today, tomorrow he might be the one lying dead in the dirt. A sensation gnawed at his heart, like a horde of insects feasting on his insides. He clenched his eyes shut and willed time to fast forward. At that moment, Esther was walking down a quiet, Upper East Side street when an arm snaked around her and a hand clamped down on her mouth and nose. A vile smell filled her nostrils, and the world began to spin. Without warning, another group appeared, armed to the teeth and swiftly encircling Esther and the man who was trying to drug her. They moved with lethal precision, and before Esther even knew what had happened, her captor groaned in pain and dropped to the ground. Just as she was about to steady herself against the wall, an arm pulled her into a familiar embrace. She found her dizzy eyes staring up at Xavier. His voice wavered with concern. "Are you all right? We need to get you to a hospital." Esther shook her head weakly and tried to push him away, but her efforts were in vain. He held her even tighter. "I'm sorry, Esther. I'm so sorry." She didn't know why he was apologizing. All she knew was that he was the last person she wanted to see. Back at the safe house, Stark was forced to open his eyes when his phone rang. He answered it with a dark scowl, and the man on the other end began talking immediately. "Sir, Esther's man intervened and sprung her. They killed half our team and took the rest with them." Stark's heart missed a beat, then resumed beating in overdrive. "The man in the photo I showed you, was it him? Was it Latham?" "No, but it was clearly her boyfriend." Stark's eyes welled up with a strange mix of relief and rage. The problem had never been Maria. It had always been Sabrina. He'd been torturing a perfectly innocent girl and had been caught red-handed trying to take Sabrina, too. He abruptly called off his enforcer, and his heart plummeted as he took in Maria's fear and devastation. He wished he could rush forward to comfort her, to act the hero, but he was paralyzed. The failed abduction of Sabrina had put him in danger, and he had no choice but to beat a quick retreat. Nancy heaved breaths as she continued to feign hysterics, but the goon's sudden change in demeanor made her confident her plan had succeeded. The only remaining question was whether she could escape before Jonathan and his team arrived and blew her cover. At that moment, Stark's henchmen sliced through her ropes and unbound her. As her hands fell free, one of them shot into the air in a quick wave, a signal to Norman, if he was out there, not to shoot. With the henchmen long gone, Nancy staggered to her feet, looking around in fake panic before sprinting out of the warehouse. Just as she made it back to the street, two boys scampered in front of her. One, a bit older, brandished a toy gun, while his younger brother ran after him, pleading to play with it. Overcome with eagerness, the younger one tripped over a stone and scraped his knee on the asphalt. Blood immediately flowed, and at the sight of the child's pain, Nancy came to an abrupt halt. She ran over to the kid and scooped him up, checking the wounds on his knees. Seeing it wasn't too severe, she fished out a tissue from her pocket and pressed it to his knee. "Don't cry, little man. Brave boys don't bleed." The boy sobbed, but then noticed the blood on Nancy's neck and seemed to forget his tears. "Did you just get that?" "Sure did. And look how brave we both are." Suddenly, a look of inspiration crossed her face, and she dug her hand into her pocket, pulling out the red velvet cupcake in its small box. She held it out to him. "Here's a treat for your bravery." The boy's eyes went wide, and he snatched it with a smile. "Thank you." "It's getting late, and it's not safe over here. You and your brother get home quick, okay?" The older boy nodded, guiltily passed the toy to his younger brother, and led him away. Just as the boys disappeared around the corner, a swarm of vehicles sped onto the scene. With a loud screech, the lead car skidded to a stop, and Jonathan sprang out of the passenger seat, storming out like a hurricane. When he saw Nancy, he stopped in his tracks. His eyes were ablaze with the intent to kill, and he radiated an aura of ruthless savagery, like a god of slaughter summoned from the pits of hell. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Nancy hurried over to him and took his hand. The moment she touched him, she could feel his palm was cold and slicked with sweat. Even in the midst of a brutal battle, she had never seen him so anxious. The news that she was in danger had affected him more than she had ever imagined. She now realized that he had exactly one Achilles heel, and it was her. Nancy grasped Jonathan's other hand and was about to speak when she saw his piercing gaze land on her wounded neck. His aura immediately chilled further, and her eyes shot up to meet his. "It's nothing, I promise. Just a scratch." Jonathan narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing her wound. She thought he was about to offer help, but instead, he withdrew his hand and turned away, leaving her staring at his retreating back. At that moment, Norman and a few others arrived and leapt out of their cars. Before Norman could speak, Jonathan turned on him in a seething fury. "Do my orders mean nothing to you? I told you to clear the warehouse." Norman bowed his head. "I know. I'm sorry." "It was my fault," Nancy interjected. "I assumed he was watching and signaled him not to shoot." Ignoring her, Jonathan continued to berate Norman. "You had one job, protect Maria. How was she abducted under your watch?" But Norman remained silent, his gaze downturned. "I promise it's not his fault. I slipped them so I could convince Stark that—" But Nancy was suddenly cut off by Jonathan. "Enough!" His roar startled her. She stumbled backward, staring at him in shock. Turning back to Norman, Jonathan issued an order. "You, along with them, all of you will run back to your quarters. Maybe that will improve your stamina, so that some girl can't slip you so easily." Nancy bristled at the implication and intervened yet again. "I'm not just some girl, and for your information, I had Sahara plan the route to avoid Norman and his team. They did nothing wrong." Jonathan turned to her, and the sheer insanity of his gaze silenced her protest. Norman and his team promptly departed, and when they all cleared the scene, Jonathan turned and headed for his car. Nancy ran to catch up with him, diving into the passenger seat just as he floored it and the car shot forward. She braced herself against the door handle for long enough to buckle her seatbelt, and then turned to look at the man beside her. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, nostrils flared, and jaw clenched. The car was thick with tension, and Nancy realized she had never seen Jonathan so angry. And she didn't have to ask him to know that it wasn't just an expression of fear. He was also furious at her decision-making. He had always hated the idea of putting herself in danger, and though she knew it was born out of love, she couldn't help finding it a little condescending. But she knew that from his perspective, she'd risked everything without so much as consulting him or giving him a heads up. And in his defense, she wasn't a single woman anymore. She was engaged now, and she hadn't treated him like her equal. A wave of guilt washed over Nancy, but she also knew that if she was given the chance, she would make the same choice again. It had nothing to do with Jonathan's ability to protect her. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was afraid that if Stark discovered a single hitch, he'd retreat into a defensive shell, and she'd never get the vengeance her family deserved. As a whirlwind of emotions raged in her heart, Nancy bit her lip and slowly reached out to touch Jonathan's thigh. Nancy laid her hand on Jonathan's leg, her fingertips tracing the solid breadth of his muscular thigh. She tried tentatively poking him, but he remained unresponsive. Seeing that he was unlikely to change his mind anytime soon, Nancy pulled a small mirror out of her bag and set about tending to the bloody gash on her neck. She moistened a tissue and wiped away the dried blood, revealing a shallow, 2-centimeter-long cut. To her relief, it didn't look bad enough to need any special attention. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jonathan's gaze drift over to her. His eyes grew colder, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. His anger was a wild animal straining to break out of his cage. But the car's modest speed bellied his bubbling frustration. They soon eased into the parking garage beneath Jonathan's building, and he parked the car and exited without so much as a word. Pursing her lips, Nancy followed him in silence. When they entered his apartment, Jonathan shrugged off his coat and strode to his office, seemingly indifferent to Nancy's presence. After changing her clothes and preparing a meal for them, Nancy approached his office and knocked. When she didn't get a response, she opened the door and stepped in. Jonathan stood before the window with his back to her, his silhouette shrouded in a haze of cigarette smoke. His icy aura sent a pang of anxiety through Nancy's heart, and it inspired her to be direct. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, and her voice wavered. "I'm sorry, Jonathan. I shouldn't have acted on my own. Can you let go of your anger?" Jonathan remained silent, stubbing his cigarette out in the ashtray. Nancy couldn't help but notice the gesture. She once mentioned her aversion to cigarettes, and he refrained from smoking them in her presence ever since. It struck her that even in his anger, it was still obvious that he loved her. Emboldened, she pressed her face against his shirt, pulling him gently. "Let's have dinner. I'll make something for us." Jonathan remained unmoved, so Nancy grasped his hand and tugged him toward the dining room. With a little effort, she managed to get him seated at the table, where the meal was already laid out. She filled his plate with food and used a wet cloth to clean his hands, and he watched silently throughout, offering no resistance. She sat down across from him, and when he finally picked up his fork, she exhaled in relief. His face remained devoid of any expression as he ate, with the soft clinking of their silverware the only noise in the massive apartment. Nancy racked her brain on how to appease the visibly irate man across from her. When he finished his first plate of food, Nancy swiftly refilled it. She hoped that her acts of service would show him that she hadn't left him out of her plan because she didn't care, but because the situation developed quickly. She watched him eat and was impressed that his anger didn't detract from his elegant manners. He was, as always, impeccably controlled. Her initial goal had been to calm him, but soon she found herself captivated by the movements of his body. Noticing her propped chin and forgotten meal, Jonathan clattered his spoon against his bowl, and Nancy jolted back to reality, her face heating up as she quickly resumed eating. When he finally finished, Jonathan left without a word and retreated back to his study. It was clear there was nothing Nancy could do at the moment that would calm him down. So she grabbed her phone and texted Esther. "How do you calm down an angry man?" Esther quickly wrote back, and Nancy could practically hear her saying the words she typed. "Easy. Sex. If it doesn't work the first time, you try twice. If twice doesn't cut it, then thrice. As long as you have the patience, his big dumb brain will eventually forget why it was angry." Nancy let out a soft sigh and rubbed her forehead. Esther had given her an idea, but she wasn't sure if she was really ready to take such a bold step. With her heart pounding in trepidation, she rose to her feet. Heading to the bathroom, Nancy took a careful shower and then applied her skincare routine before spritzing on the perfume that Esther had made her. After choosing a lace nightgown from her closet that Jonathan had never seen, she approached his office and hovered outside the door. From within, she could hear the murmur of Jonathan's phone conversation. She only caught bits and pieces, but she was certain that he and Jack were talking about Stark. Waiting until the room fell silent, Nancy took a deep breath and eased the door open with a gentle knock. Jonathan was focused on his computer, and his gaze only flicked up to her for a brief moment before returning to his work. Nancy could tell he was set on giving her the cold shoulder, but she hadn't come this far to be brushed off that easily. She knew that if she was ever going to thaw him out, she would have to bring the heat. Summoning all her courage, she strode across the room, swept his arm off his desk, and slid into his lap with a graceful shimmy. Caught off guard, he quickly shut his laptop. Just as the screen went dark, a voice cut off abruptly. "Jonathan, it's very important that—" Nancy's eyes widened in horror. Had he been in the middle of a video conference when she walked in? Had they seen her in her nightgown, brazenly climbing onto Jonathan's lap? She felt her cheeks burn with mortification. The first time she'd ever taken the initiative to seduce a man, and it had been broadcast to God knows how many people. The embarrassment was unbearable. As Nancy battled the heat that had flooded her face, Jonathan remained motionless and pointedly averted his gaze. But after taking a brief moment to calm her nerves, Nancy figured that since she'd already suffered the embarrassment, she might as well commit to her plan. She moved her arm to hook it around Jonathan's neck, but as she leaned in to nibble his ear, his phone suddenly rang. Jonathan answered it and put it on speakerphone, rejoining the conference call he just abruptly exited. "Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties. Where were we?" Nancy shot him a disgruntled look, but he pretended not to see it. As the business discussion quickly got back up to speed, Nancy remained perched on Jonathan's lap, with her arms slung around him. She was determined to wait out the meeting, but after 30 minutes, and with no end in sight, she started to get restless. Leaning into Jonathan's chest, she listened to the vibrations in his chest as he began speaking about the next phase of their project in Mexico. At such close quarters, his voice was deep and alluring, and there had always been something that drew Nancy to men who were as focused on their work as she was. His orderly speech and the way he quickly weighed decisions struck her as extraordinary. As she marveled at his performance, it suddenly gave her an idea. What might it take to ruffle someone who seemed so utterly composed? When Jonathan finished speaking, Nancy leaned closer and planted a soft kiss on his earlobe. Jonathan's breath hitched for a moment, but his voice remained steady. "Jack, why don't you brief us on the next agenda item? I want to hear what our market targets are for the next quarter." While the director of the marketing department spoke, Nancy inched closer to Jonathan, pressing her body against his. This was uncharted territory for her, but she couldn't deny that she was enjoying the thrill. Noticing his body stiffening slightly under her touch, she pressed on, whispering in a low, soft voice. "I've been a bad girl." Jonathan flinched at the sound of Nancy's seductive whisper. He had never seen this side of her before, and with his anger melting away, it was all he could do to resist. She ran her fingers through his hair and continued. "I know I was naughty, but I thought of a way to make it up to you." She toyed with the top button of his shirt and leaned in closer, her breath tickling his ear. "I'm going to count down from 10, and when I get to 0, your anger will magically disappear." 10, she whispered, her left hand tracing the contour of his face before coming to rest on his lips. Jonathan's heart raced, and his thoughts grew fuzzy. 9, she continued. Across the room, another voice chimed in on the call. "Jonathan, do you agree with the board's plan? It's a big risk, but if it pays off..." Jonathan had only a vague idea of what they were talking about, and just as he was about to speak up, Nancy murmured in his ear again. 8. She popped another button on his shirt, and a jolt shot through him. Words teetered on the tip of his tongue, but then fell back, leaving his mind momentarily blank. After a beat, Jack's voice came through. "Jonathan, is there an issue with your signal again? Do you want to call us back?" Jonathan cleared his throat and spoke up gruffly. "Sorry, let's just move on to the next item. Financing." He strained to focus, but just as he got his train of thought back on the rails, he heard Nancy purring in his ear. 7. The budget. His words died in his throat, and he saw a small smile play on Nancy's lips. 6. A sudden rush of heat surged through Jonathan, his thoughts whirling into a maelstrom. The others, sensing something amiss, started calling out to him. "Jonathan, can you hear us?" "Jonathan, we were talking about the budget. We didn't catch the rest." As I was saying, the budget is according to the original plan. An additional 10% will be allocated in the event that..." 5, Nancy interjected. Jonathan stammered. He knew that if he tried to keep up with the meeting, he'd likely make some terrible decisions, but he didn't want to give Nancy the victory either. Frustrated, he glanced down at the stunning woman curled up in his lap and pinched the bridge of his nose. Nancy popped the last button on his shirt. 4. Then she untucked it from his slacks. 3. Jonathan was no longer even pretending to listen to the meeting. His breathing grew heavy, and his dark gaze was fixed solely on Nancy. 2. She declared triumphantly, kissing in a line from his ear to his chest. 1. He heard the metallic clink of his belt being unbuckled, and with the swipe of his hand, he hung up the call. As soon as Jonathan hung up the call, Nancy sprung out of his lap and tried to make her escape. But before she could even take a step, Jonathan's strong grip ensnared her. Her feet left the ground, and before she knew it, she was perched atop his desk, trapped beneath his intense gaze. His voice was a gravelly whisper, carrying a weight that seemed to press down on her. Don't poke a lion if you aren't ready for it to wake up. She bit her lip, her eyes locked onto his. But he put a finger to her lips and cut her off. Where did you learn that little trick? Caught off guard, Nancy pressed her lips together and blushed. I guess I just improvised at the moment. A smirk crept onto Jonathan's face as he leaned in, his voice a murmur. Have you considered the repercussions? She squirmed under his gaze. Obviously, but nothing else seemed to get your attention. He sighed and pulled her into a hug. You really scared me today, and it was totally preventable. I know. You deserve to be included in decisions like that. I promise it won't happen again. After a moment's silence, Jonathan's lips parted. This isn't the first time, you know. You seem to have a knack for getting yourself into danger. Nancy dropped her gaze, feeling like a scolded child. You may not realize it, but I know what it feels like to lose you. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as they met him. 3.5 years ago, I was intent on finally meeting you, so I called to introduce myself. But I was told by whoever answered, maybe it was Stark himself, that you drowned less than a week earlier. His gaze grew intense. I can't go through that again. Nancy felt a lump in her throat. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and in an apologetic embrace, her voice a whimpered plea. I'm sorry, my love. I made a mistake. After a beat, Jonathan hugged her back. Nancy knew it was a wordless sign that she was forgiven, and her heart swelled with relief. Jonathan then leaned back and scrutinized that cut on her neck, gently feeling it for any signs of infection. Does it still hurt? Nancy shook her head. She had experienced far worse pain than a mere cut, and looking back, she was impressed with her own bravery and calmness while a man held a knife to her throat. Were you scared? She shook her head again. In truth, the fear she'd experienced then was nothing compared to the fear that she'd damaged Jonathan's trust. With a helpless chuckle, Jonathan ran his fingers through her hair. Maria, I really don't know what to do with you. Nancy's eyes flickered with mischief, and she pulled Jonathan toward her with his unbuckled belt. I can think of something. Jonathan hummed in agreement, then leaned in for a powerful, passionate kiss. When their bodies finally separated again, the moon was in the sky, and the office was in a state of chaos. They had littered the floor with papers and pens, and nearly destroyed his laptop in their fervor. After putting their underwear back on, Jonathan went to get a glass of water, and Nancy bent down to clean up the papers. As she sorted through the first pile, one particular document caught her eye. A life insurance contract. She flipped it open and saw that Jonathan had taken out a policy on himself and listed her as the sole beneficiary. The figure listed was astonishing, and as her eyes skimmed the details, she saw that the contract had been purchased 2 months prior, before they had even got engaged. A complex rush of emotions flooded her heart. She hated to think about the possibility of Jonathan dying, but the fact that he'd felt so certain about their relationship for so long was an incredible testament to his commitment. A noise at the door jolted her from her thoughts, and she quickly closed the document. Jonathan re-entered the room and smiled warmly. "Don't worry about all that. I'll clean it up later. Besides, I have a little surprise." Nancy set down the papers and looked up at him to see that he was carrying a plate of red velvet cupcakes from the bakery she'd visited that afternoon. Looking at the dessert spread out before her, Nancy's emotion threatened to overflow. "Why are you so good to me?" Jonathan kissed her on the head and pinched her cheek affectionately. "You're my wife. If I don't treat you well, who should I? I just wish I'd know how wonderful you were the first time I saw you. I wasted so much time running away." "Let's not dwell on the past. Imagine how happy your parents would be just to know that you and Jacob are both alive and well." Nancy nodded and leaned against Jonathan's chest. He was absolutely right, and Nancy knew that the sooner she settled the score with Stark, the sooner they would be able to move on to happily ever after. Meanwhile, Esther got ready for bed while Xavier sat in the living room. She appreciated that he had gone to so much trouble to protect her from Stark, but she still didn't think it was a good idea for them to spend time together. Polishing off a glass of water, she stepped into the doorway between her bedroom and the living room. "I'm fine here, Xavier. I appreciate you getting me home in one piece, but Jonathan's men have things under control. I'm heading to bed now, so you should probably get home too." Xavier looked up at her, but didn't budge from the couch. "It's no hassle. I'll be right here in the living room in case anything happens." Esther chuckled lightly at his insistence. Was he aware of his encroaching presence, or did he just pity her for the threat on her life? Regardless, she didn't want him there. "Listen, Xavier, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but it's weird having you hover around. We've been over this a million times. It's just not a good idea for us to hang out." Xavier's eyes hinted at a silent sadness as he caught her drift, but he remained motionless. A standoff ensued, but Esther was exhausted, and after 30 seconds, she gave up trying to get him to leave. Throwing her hands up, she spun on her heel and went back into her room. "Have it your way then, weirdo. There's a blanket in the closet." The door clicked shut behind her, and Esther flopped onto her bed, flipping around restlessly. Xavier had insisted on accompanying her home after helping her get away from Stark's men, and despite her ignoring him all afternoon, he refused to leave her side. His stubbornness had always infuriated her, but as she listened to him stirring on the other side of the door, she had to admit that she felt a little safer knowing he was out there. Esther slept like a rock until the blare of her alarm woke her up at 7. She glanced at the blanket on her chair. As soon as Jonathan hung up the call, Nancy sprung out of his lap and tried to make her escape. But before she could even take a step, Jonathan's strong grip ensnared her. Her feet left the ground, and before she knew it, she was perched atop his desk, trapped beneath his intense gaze. His voice was a gravelly whisper, carrying a weight that seemed to press down on her. "Don't poke a lion if you aren't ready for it to wake up." She bit her lip, her eyes locked onto his. But he put a finger to her lips and cut her off. "Where did you learn that little trick?" Caught off guard, Nancy pressed her lips together and blushed. "I guess I just improvised at the moment." A smirk crept onto Jonathan's face as he leaned in, his voice a murmur. "Have you considered the repercussions?" She squirmed under his gaze. "Obviously, but nothing else seemed to get your attention." He sighed and pulled her into a hug. "You really scared me today, and it was totally preventable." "I know. You deserve to be included in decisions like that. I promise it won't happen again." After a moment's silence, Jonathan's lips parted. "This isn't the first time, you know. You seem to have a knack for getting yourself into danger." Nancy dropped her gaze, feeling like a scolded child. "You may not realize it, but I know what it feels like to lose you." She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as they met him. 3.5 years ago, I was intent on finally meeting you, so I called to introduce myself. But I was told by whoever answered, maybe it was Stark himself, that you drowned less than a week earlier. His gaze grew intense. I can't go through that again. Nancy felt a lump in her throat. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and in an apologetic embrace, her voice a whimpered plea. I'm sorry, my love. I made a mistake. After a beat, Jonathan hugged her back. Nancy knew it was a wordless sign that she was forgiven, and her heart swelled with relief. Jonathan then leaned back and scrutinized that cut on her neck, gently feeling it for any signs of infection. Does it still hurt? Nancy shook her head. She had experienced far worse pain than a mere cut, and looking back, she was impressed with her own bravery and calmness while a man held a knife to her throat. Were you scared? She shook her head again. In truth, the fear she'd experienced then was nothing compared to the fear that she damaged Jonathan's trust. With a helpless chuckle, Jonathan ran his fingers through her hair. Maria, I really don't know what to do with you. Nancy's eyes flickered with mischief, and she pulled Jonathan toward her with his unbuckled belt. I can think of something. Jonathan hummed in agreement, then leaned in for a powerful, passionate kiss. When their bodies finally separated again, the moon was in the sky, and the office was in a state of chaos. They had littered the floor with papers and pens, and nearly destroyed his laptop in their fervor. After putting their underwear back on, Jonathan went to get a glass of water, and Nancy bent down to clean up the papers. As she sorted through the first pile, one particular document caught her eye. A life insurance contract. She flipped it open and saw that Jonathan had taken out a policy on himself and listed her as the sole beneficiary. The figure listed was astonishing, and as her eyes skimmed the details, she saw that the contract had been purchased 2 months prior, before they had even got engaged. A complex rush of emotions flooded her heart. She hated to think about the possibility of Jonathan dying, but the fact that he'd felt so certain about their relationship for so long was an incredible testament to his commitment. A noise at the door jolted her from her thoughts, and she quickly closed the document. Jonathan re-entered the room and smiled warmly. Don't worry about all that. I'll clean it up later. Besides, I have a little surprise. Nancy set down the papers and looked up at him to see that he was carrying a plate of red velvet cupcakes from the bakery she'd visited that afternoon. Looking at the dessert spread out before her, Nancy's emotion threatened to overflow. Why are you so good to me? Jonathan kissed her on the head and pinched her cheek affectionately. You're my wife. If I don't treat you well, who should I? I just wish I'd know how wonderful you were the first time I saw you. I wasted so much time running away. Let's not dwell on the past. Imagine how happy your parents would be just to know that you and Jacob are both alive and well. Nancy nodded and leaned against Jonathan's chest. He was absolutely right, and Nancy knew that the sooner she settled the score with Stark, the sooner they would be able to move on to happily ever after. Meanwhile, Esther got ready for bed while Xavier sat in the living room. She appreciated that he had gone to so much trouble to protect her from Stark, but she still didn't think it was a good idea for them to spend time together. Polishing off a glass of water, she stepped into the doorway between her bedroom and the living room. I'm fine here, Xavier. I appreciate you getting me home in one piece, but Jonathan's men have things under control. I'm heading to bed now, so you should probably get home too. Xavier looked up at her, but didn't budge from the couch. It's no hassle. I'll be right here in the living room in case anything happens. Esther chuckled lightly at his insistence. Was he aware of his encroaching presence, or did he just pity her for the threat on her life? Regardless, she didn't want him there. Listen, Xavier, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but it's weird having you hover around. We've been over this a million times. It's just not a good idea for us to hang out. Xavier's eyes hinted at a silent sadness as he caught her drift, but he remained motionless. A standoff ensued, but Esther was exhausted, and after 30 seconds, she gave up trying to get him to leave. Throwing her hands up, she spun on her heel and went back into her room. Have it your way then, weirdo. There's a blanket in the closet. The door clicked shut behind her, and Esther flopped onto her bed, flipping around restlessly. Xavier had insisted on accompanying her home after helping her get away from Stark's men, and despite her ignoring him all afternoon, he refused to leave her side. His stubbornness had always infuriated her, but as she listened to him stirring on the other side of the door, she had to admit that she felt a little safer knowing he was out there. Esther slept like a rock until the blare of her alarm woke her up at 7 a.m. When she opened her bedroom door, the first thing she saw was the radiant morning sunlight spilling across the room, illuminating the man sprawled on her couch like a Baroque painting. Xavier lay there, eyes shut, his hair and body shining under the sun's golden rays. Part of her was surprised that he hadn't left. For that matter, he hadn't even used a blanket. As she shivered in the morning chill, she glanced at the blanket on her chair and considered putting it on Xavier. But just as quickly, she rolled her eyes and continued to the bathroom. After all, she had practically begged him to leave. If he got cold, that was his problem. By the time Esther finished in the bathroom, Xavier had stirred awake. She gave him a cursory glance as she crossed back to her bedroom, and his rumpled suit and bleary eyes seemed a testament to a restless night of sleep. As Esther got dressed, she ran through everything she had to do that morning. She had considered canceling her meetings so she could lay low after what had happened the day before, but she reasoned that Stark would never come after her again so quickly after his previous attempt was foiled. Nonetheless, it was clear that the show she and Latham had put on for him hadn't worked, and she'd have to be exceptionally careful at public events going forward. When she emerged from her room, she found Xavier poised at the door, keys in hand. "I'll drive you to work," he offered. She paused, her gaze steady and her voice neutral. "No need. I'll take the train." His eyes held hers for 2 silent seconds before his hand reached out, catching her arm. "Esther, let's date." She blinked in disbelief, then narrowed her eyes. "What the hell did you just say?" "Let's date." She was about to laugh, but as she looked at his face, she realized he wasn't kidding. "Are you on drugs?" "The answer is no." He looked flabbergasted at her immediate rejection. "Why not?" "How many times do we have to do this? We're not compatible, Xavier. I think you have a stick up your ass. You think I'm a slut. We're like oil and water, dude." In truth, Esther had been serious when she voiced her desire to settle down a few days earlier. She wasn't seriously considering marrying the accountant back home, but the fact that it held any appeal at all was indication of how just ready she was to have a little consistency in life. And the only consistent thing about Xavier was that he pissed her off. Having finally put her shoes on, Esther grabbed her bag and stepped through the door. "I'm leaving, and I'm running late, so I'll take the ride. Just don't be weird." Xavier didn't respond, but as she made her way to the elevator, he was right there behind her. After dropping Esther off, Xavier went to his office and called Latham, who answered with surprise. "Mr. Sloan, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Did you replace Esther's lipstick the other day?" Latham paused, sounding taken aback. "When did you develop such an interest in cosmetics?" "Just tell me if you bought it or not." No. We were just messing around for Stark's sake. I'm sure she can take care of her own lipstick needs." "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Talk to you later." Xavier hung up, then quickly dialed Maria to find out what brand Esther used. Finally, he sent one of his assistants out to buy the full range of colors that the brand offered. His plan was to arrange them like a bouquet of flowers and present them to Esther the next time he saw her. With everything arranged, Xavier sat back and took a deep breath. Not only had he never had a serious relationship with a woman before, he'd never even tried to pursue one. He knew he could come off as stubborn and cold, so he hoped that Esther could see the warmth in his actions. And thanks to his stubbornness, she was going to have plenty of opportunities. Unlike her, Xavier wasn't going to give up. As Esther arrived at work, it suddenly occurred to her that she hadn't spoken to Nancy about her near miss with Stark's men the day before. She dialed her number and Nancy picked up after one ring.
Esther, you'll never believe what happened yesterday.
Recalling Nancy's text the night before, Esther smirked and couldn't resist a playful taunt.
How many sweet nothings did you have to whisper to win him over?
I had him wrapped around my finger before we even went to bed. Impressive, right?
Aren't you a flirtatious little butterfly?
Nancy burst into laughter.
Yeah, well, it nearly went off the rails. I had no idea he was on a video call, and Wait, don't tell me you threw yourself at him in front of everyone. It was so bad. Thankfully, he shut the computer fast enough that I don't think anyone saw my face. How did you manage to rile him up so badly in the first place? He seemed so even-tempered.
Nancy sighed.
Star tried to abduct me yesterday, and I knew if I let my security team intervene, it would tip him off. So I ditched my bodyguards and let Stark's men take me.
What?
No wonder he was angry. You know better than anyone what Stark is capable of. And I also know how careful he is. All I had to do was put on a show and convince him I was innocent, and then he let me go. Now he suspects me much less than ever. Still, it's not just you against the world anymore. You have a fiancé now.
Nancy let out a playful scoff.
Whose side are you on? The one where you don't get murdered by Stark again. Speaking of which, you weren't the only one he went after yesterday.
You too?
What happened? Are you okay?
Esther sighed.
Yeah, Xavier of all people swooped in to save me. I guess that means Stark knows about you. Unfortunately, I'll have to be more careful going forward, but at least he knows I'm not an easy target. Besides, he's clearly desperate if he's coming for us in broad daylight. Just take care of yourself, and rest assured, Stark's days are numbered.
Once the call with Esther ended, Nancy found herself replaying the events of the day before. An icy shudder coursed through her as the gravity of Esther's insinuation settled in. Stark was like a cornered animal. His desperation was plain to see, but it also made him more dangerous. Her thoughts drifted to Jonathan. He seemed so invincible to her that she allowed herself to believe that no one would ever come for him directly. But his increasing influence would also mean more enemies, and she no longer felt certain he was untouchable. Chilled by the thought and desperate to hear his voice, Nancy anxiously dialed Jonathan.
Maria, missing me already?
I just heard from Esther, and it got me thinking. With everything going on in Houston and the rumors about Brock, I think we need to be more careful. Thanks to the Apex, you're more powerful than ever, and we can't keep assuming we know who all your enemies are. Jonathan hummed in agreement as he considered Nancy's words.
You're probably right. I've gotten overconfident. I'll start altering my daily patterns and see what we can learn about our new competitors. It's not just real estate and finance anymore. It's tech and the automotive industry too.
Don't forget the people close to you. If they're truly loyal, they'll understand that you have to keep tabs on them.
Don't worry, Maria. If there's any threats coming from inside the company, I'll root them out.
Good. And don't eat anything prepared by a stranger.
Jonathan laughed. My goodness, you're starting to sound like a mother.
Nancy blushed, and her voice tinged with sarcasm. I'm so sorry for caring about your well-being.
Who said sounding like a mother is a bad thing? It won't be that long before you are one.
Nancy's heart fluttered at his words, and before long, the intense anxiety she felt only moments earlier had disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, Stark was scouring a budget report at his office in Houston when his assistant knocked on his door. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but Damien is here to see you. Acknowledging with a nod, Stark set the file aside, and a slight man with dark, bird-like features entered the room. He had been Stark's most trusted spy for years, but his newest assignment was sure to be his most difficult, digging up dirt on Jonathan Davis. He waved him over, and Damien handed him a thin file.
It took me some doing, but I managed to get his flight records for the last 6 months.
Stark leafed through the papers meticulously and marked the details and patterns that immediately stood out to him. Finally, he looked up at Damien.
Are you certain nothing's been overlooked?
Damien shook his head,
confident. Everything there is accurate. It's possible he's using other means of transportation that are harder to track, but I doubt it. With a nod, Stark scribbled down all of Jonathan's reoccurring destinations: Seattle, Boston, New York, and Mexico. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, pondering, before he crossed Mexico off the list. If Jonathan had been involved in Jacob's escape, he had no reason to hide him there. That left 3 plausible options: Seattle, Boston, and New York City. The latter was Jonathan's home turf, which meant it was both the likeliest place and also the hardest place for Stark to operate in. As for Seattle, the bulk of Jonathan's trips came before Jacob was even taken. That left Boston as the most obvious place to start. What do we know about Jonathan's operations in Boston? Limited, but I learned from someone in the mayor's office that he approached them about a major public technology partnership. It hasn't been publicized yet, but she expects the announcement to come soon. Stark raised an eyebrow. In a city he has no experience with? Find out everything you can about those trips. I want timelines, contacts, where he stayed, every scrap of data you can get. And send people to stake out the most prestigious high schools. They've probably changed Jacob's appearance, but there's one thing that will never change. He's unable to speak. At that very moment, Jacob was warming up for his first game with the school's basketball team. It was like he'd become an entirely new person after regaining his voice, and the abrupt change in his demeanor earned him friendly jabs from his teammates, along with the affectionate nickname of Dr. Jekyll. For the first time in his life, he found himself surrounded by friends, and their companionship colored his life in vibrant new hues. The changes weren't simply psychological either. When he looked in the mirror now, he hardly recognized the young man he saw. His hair, once long and unkempt, had been cut short and styled in a quiff. His stooped shoulders and sunken eyes had been straightened up and filled with vigor, and his pale skin had darkened to a healthy shade of olive. Thinking back on his time as Sandy, he could only laugh in disbelief. When the warm-up ended and the team headed back to the locker room, Jacob took a moment to text Jonathan and let him know the good news. "Brother-in-law, I just wanted you to know that I'm making good on my promise. I already made the basketball team, and I'm in the starting lineup in our first game of the season tonight." Unbeknownst to Jacob, Jonathan was in the shower and left his phone on the couch with Nancy. She saw his phone light up with an incoming message, and when she glanced over, her jaw dropped in disbelief at Jacob's news. But her eyes quickly narrowed with suspicion. She unlocked her own phone and saw she had gotten 0 messages. She had never imagined a day when she wouldn't be the first person on Jacob's call list. Pulling up her own text thread with him, she realized it had been nearly a week since she'd heard from him. She couldn't help wondering how much else Jacob knew about her brother that she didn't. Just as a pang of jealousy stabbed at her heart, Jonathan emerged from the bathroom, wearing nothing but a towel. She snatched his phone and shoved it at him with a look of betrayal, like a wife who had just discovered her husband's affair. "What did you do to my brother?" Jonathan shook his head in bewilderment and read the message on his home screen. "I don't understand. Do you not like basketball? How is this a bad thing?" "It's not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing." And instead of telling his loving, adoring sister about it, he decided to tell some guy he's known for 6 weeks. Jonathan couldn't help but laugh. "I'm sorry. Some guy? You stole my brother." Jonathan winked. "Better keep a close eye on Esther then. I'm in need of a new best friend." Nancy scoffed, and Jonathan pulled her into a hug. "I get why seeing Jacob branch out is scary. You've spent the last 4 years having to worry about him every minute of every day, and it's hard to break that habit. But you said it yourself. He's doing wonderfully. It's okay to enjoy it." Nancy nodded, her anger slowly morphing into embarrassment. "I know it's silly. I just did everything I could think of to try to help him. And then you spent 1 day with him and suddenly he's a changed man." Jonathan hummed in understanding and pulled back, locking his eyes with her and raising her hand to his chest. "All I did was give the tools. You gave him the inspiration. The only reason he asked me for help in the first place was because I told him that you needed his help, and he could only be there for you once he was strong enough to be there for himself. He gently tapped her nose, his voice softening. Your brother cares about you above all. He's doing all of this for you. At the sound of Jonathan's words, Nancy's discontentment finally began to melt away. As for today, let me just ask you one question. Do you know a single thing about basketball? Nancy laughed, realizing Jonathan was right. She wanted Jacob to have a positive male figure in his life, and he finally had one. But just as she was about to give Jonathan a heartfelt thanks, she looked up and realized he was completely naked. Her breath hitched like it always did at the sight of his towering physique. Every muscle in his body seemed to be perfectly toned and lean, and his skin was still glowing with moisture from the shower. She was just about to reach out and touch him when she narrowed her eyes. He was doing the exact same thing to her that she had done to him the day before. Feigning indignation, she threw her hands over her face. I know exactly what you're doing. Go put some clothes on. He acquiesced with a shrug, and when he turned to retrieve his towel, Nancy's gaze fell on his back, tracing the lines of his muscles as they cascaded toward his waist. As he reached for the towel, the sight of his muscles flexing and extending in a gentle dance stirred something deep within her. By the time her gaze swept across the elegant curve of his waist and landed on his perfect butt, she'd already lost the game. As though sensing her intentions, Jonathan swiveled on his heels just as Nancy ran toward him. Reaching out, he swept her into his arms and kissed her passionately. He carried her to the couch and laid down on top of her. But just as he began to strip off her clothes, her phone vibrated underneath her. Pulling the phone out from under herself, she couldn't help but notice who had texted her. Before she could even process it, she had shoved Jonathan off and curled into a ball. The text was from Stark. It was a picture of him and Nancy at their engagement party, along with a caption. Since you accompanied me to the cemetery, I thought you might want to see this. Today would have been the anniversary of our engagement. When Jonathan saw what had interrupted their passion, his eyes darkened, and he clutched Nancy's phone in an iron grip. He swore to himself to kill Stark with his own two hands and make sure Nancy had a lifetime of new memories to crowd out the old ones. With that, he cradled her in his arms until she fell asleep. The next few weeks, Jonathan and Nancy became particularly wary of their surroundings and immersed themselves in work, using their nights off to plan a holiday with Jacob. In light of their recent concerns about safety, they had decided that the trip would serve two purposes: a well-deserved break and a bait to draw out their adversaries. When they finally got a weekend night off, they invited Latham and Xavier over for a quiet dinner, rather than their usual party at the Diamond Club. As they all sat down at the table, Latham looked around and narrowed his eyes. Where's my wife? Nancy laughed. She's in Los Angeles on a business trip. Xavier frowned, concern etched in his voice. Is it safe for her to travel with Stark chasing after her? Nancy forced a tight smile. Jonathan arranged protection for her. When is she coming back? Latham glanced at Xavier and a wry smile spread across his face. Why do I feel like you're showing an unusual interest in my wife? Xavier's gaze sharpened. Stop calling her your wife. It's not just me calling her that. It's also the state of New York and the U.S. government. Rolling his eyes, Xavier turned back to Nancy. Do you know when she's coming back? It's indefinite. They're launching in that market soon, so it could be months. Xavier glanced down, clearly dismayed, and Latham's eyes flashed with mischief. You know what? Maybe I should fly out there and see her. A man can only be separated from his wife for so long. Xavier turned to him and barked out his name. Latham! Nancy chimed in as they all piled onto Xavier. Let me know when you're headed to LA. We can visit Esther together. Jonathan finally caught on and wrapped his arm around Nancy's shoulder. Let's all go together. My treat. Then he turned to Xavier. What do you say? Are you coming? Xavier nodded with his jaw clenched. Yes. Just then, Jonathan checked his watch and made a face. Speaking of all being together, where's Hannah? Latham shrugged. She said she had a big deadline for work a while back, but I haven't seen her in weeks. She told me she'd be here an hour ago, and now she's not responding to my texts. Do you think there's something wrong? Nancy put a hand on his shoulder. I'm sure she's just busy. She'd tell you if something was wrong. Everyone around the table nodded in agreement, utterly unaware of how innocent they were. At that same moment, Hannah was walking into a hospital. She'd felt strange ever since her encounter with Brock, and had been dodging her friends, so she didn't have to see Jonathan. Unfortunately, just as she started to think that her wound was healing, life found a way to tear off the scab. Earlier that day, she'd been in the break room at work when she suddenly found herself nauseous in the middle of eating her lunch. Unable to make it to the bathroom, she dove for the nearest trash can to be sick. When she was finally done, she noticed that a pregnant colleague had entered and was pointing at her baby bump and looking at Hannah knowingly. Welcome to the club, sister. What her coworker meant as a casual joke had actually rattled Hannah to her core. The color drained from her face, and she ran back to her desk, looking up all the symptoms of early pregnancies. Excessive sleepiness, breast tenderness, morning sickness. As she ticked off each symptom, it was as if the walls of her world began closing in around her. She had every single one. With a moment's thought, she threw her jacket on and ran to the nearest pharmacy for a pregnancy test, thrust her money at the cashier, and ran out before she even got her change. Back at the office, she locked herself in the bathroom and took the test. After 5 excruciating minutes, the first line turned a vivid pink. Moments later, the second one did too. There was no doubting it anymore. She was pregnant with Brock's baby. Hannah was swallowed by a wave of despair, and as she stared at the double red lines, her tears began to fall. As for what she was going to do about it, she knew one thing for sure. As much as she wanted to be a mother, there was no way she could do it now, and no way she could do it with Brock. Pulling herself together, she quietly left the office and headed to the hospital to terminate the pregnancy. As she sat in the crowded waiting room, Hannah's mind inevitably drifted to Maria's pregnancy scare, the moment that had precipitated everything that had happened to Hannah since. She shook her head and couldn't help but laugh at the cruel irony of her situation. She continued to replay that night in her head until a familiar voice suddenly jolted her. Well, hello, gorgeous. Startled, she turned to find Austin, ambling over to her in flamboyant clothes. He gave her a cheeky whistle, and she blushed in embarrassment, turning her head away and feigning ignorance. But Austin was undeterred. Hannah, right? We met at the Diamond Club a while back. She continued to ignore him, hoping he would get bored and leave her alone. But just then, a deep male voice broke through the tension. Austin, we're here for your checkup, not for you to check out women. Hannah froze at the sound of the voice. It was Brock. Brock's eyes narrowed as he stepped alongside Austin and realized who he was talking to. Hannah immediately turned away, but her medical forms were visible in her lap, and Brock's eyes went wide as he saw what was written on it. Without missing a beat, Brock dismissed Austin with a wave of his hand and kneeled down in front of Hannah. Is this for you? No, it's for my imaginary friend. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with hate. Brock took it in, then spoke with chilling certainty. Is it mine? Austin, on the sidelines, suddenly chimed in. Oh my God, did you seriously knock this girl up? Hannah shot him a spiteful glance. Stay out of it. Brock narrowed his eyes. You weren't going to tell me? Why should I? It's my body, and that day was a mistake. We're as good as strangers to each other. Brock scrutinized her resolute expression, her eyes frosty. This is because of Jonathan, isn't it? Hannah stammered, and Brock continued, his voice low. Imagine his reaction when he learns that his beloved little sister spent the night with me and is carrying my child. How do you think he'll see you then? She strained to keep her fear from showing on her face. You wouldn't dare. Oh, honey, you have no idea what I would and wouldn't dare to do. Hannah felt an icy shiver creep up her spine. What exactly are you suggesting? Brock put a strong hand on her shoulder and a slight grin spread across his mouth. Have the baby. What did you say? Hannah looked at Brock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Marry me and have the baby. Afterwards, we'll divorce and I'll take custody of the child. Hannah's face turned ashen. Why the hell would I agree to that? I'm a businessman, Hannah. Everything has a price. If you do it, I'll give you a big enough alimony that you'll never have to work another day in your life. And as soon as the baby is weaned, you'll never hear from me again. Hannah looked away, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe it, but she was actually considering his offer. As much as she disliked him, there were plenty of people out there doing surrogacy for way less. When she turned back to look at him, her gaze hardened again. Why are you doing this? Does it matter? I'm offering you a lifetime of ease for 8 months of discomfort. Hannah's mind raced. It sounded too good to be true, but Hannah didn't come from a wealthy family. She would have no inheritance, and she was already working 2 jobs to support her dreams as a writer. After a moment of consideration, Hannah locked eyes with Brock and gently nodded her head. Brock smiled and snapped at Austin. Go get her in with an OBGYN. As Austin ran off and Brock sat down next to her, it felt like the world was swirling around her. When she sat down to eat lunch that day, she hadn't even known she was pregnant. And now she was sitting next to her rich future husband, who she barely knew. Inside the consultation room, the doctor did a quick ultrasound and turned to her with a smile. Good news. Your baby is healthy and everything looks normal. I'm writing a few prescriptions for vitamins, and your hormone levels are a little low, so come back next week for a checkup. If they're still low, we'll start you on some medication. Otherwise, remember to get plenty of sleep and eat healthy. And of course, no drinking or smoking. Hannah nodded along, but wasn't hearing a single word the doctor said. The whole thing just felt too surreal. When she exited the consultation room, she found Brock waiting. How did it go? What did the doctor say? Nothing much. Normal stuff. Oh, I have a follow-up next week. Good. Then we'll get the marriage certificate on Monday. Brock took her hand and led her out through the obstetrics waiting room, and Hannah suddenly noticed the other women looking at her in envy. My God, did you see how handsome her husband is? And he's so supportive. I couldn't even get Doug to drive me here. I had to take an Uber. What a pair. That baby is going to be beautiful. Hannah chuckled at the absurdity of it all and followed Brock to the main entrance where Austin was already waiting. When they arrived at Brock's apartment, Hannah was blown away by its size and grandeur. She knew he was rich, but the only apartment she'd ever seen that was as nice as this one was Jonathan's. Suddenly, she remembered the dinner she'd missed in her rush to get to the hospital. Her heart ached at the thought of Jonathan's reaction when he found out she was marrying one of his rivals and having his child. She had sworn to herself that she would find a way to get over Jonathan, but she never imagined it looking like this. As she gawked at the extravagant penthouse, Brock took his jacket off and called to his sister, who came running around the corner in yoga pants. She looked at Hannah with open suspicion, and Brock urged Hannah forward. Ashley, Hannah, Ashley. You two are going to be sisters-in-law.